read Foul by Andrew Jennings, there are 2 chapters devoted to Mr. Hargitay. He's a Swiss-Hungarian. He has all sorts of friends in FIFA, or so he led us to believe. And between these 3 men, we were told that we would have the inside running and inside knowledge of what was going on inside the heads of the executive committee. $5.1 million? Peter Hargitay, or the ECN company, got around $1.3 million. Again, taxpayers' money. What's the plus? It's for travel, first class, of course, hotels, that sort of thing that consultants generally charge. Fedor Radman got $3.8 million. Now, this is all public information. One of the things, at least our government has audited the accounts. $3.8 million over 24 months is $156,333 a month. I don't know whether any of you have ever worked with PwC or Deloitte or KPMG, but they would think that was a pretty good contract, let alone for one man who, and I say as someone who was the head of corporate affairs, I saw very little work or output from either of them. And he got paid $156,000 a month for 24 months. Even the ECN contract was approximately $50,000 a month for 24 months. Again, a journalist would ask, what the hell was that money needed for? Why did we pay it? And then we look at, and I'm not going to answer that question today, you can buy the book for that. Australia's favourite EXCO members. We're up there with Denmark, New Zealand, Sweden, Scandinavia in terms of transparency, in terms of governance. We've got a long history of being a liberal democracy, etc. But when it came to playing the game of the FIFA bidding process, we were right in there with them. And that goes back to what I was saying earlier about the signals that went up within FIFA EXCO in May 2008 at that dinner. Reinald Tamari, remember him? He was actually suspended by FIFA because the Sunday Times caught him in a sting. But we gave them, Oceania, another $4 million. So we're now adding up to $50 million of taxpayers' money. It was for good works. No one can dispute that it's fantastic to be giving $4 million for sports development projects in Oceania over 3 years. So good, in fact, that there's our Prime Minister of the day, plus the CEO of the day, with a come-play ball, signing a tripartite agreement, giving away $4 million of taxpayers' money. Now, that's not all that Reinald Tamari asked for. It's also not all that Reinald Tamari got from the Australian bid. But you will recall that a few months, or about 18 months or 16 months after this happened, he was also caught in a sting asking for some of the same things that he already had from us. But nonetheless, he was going to vote for us. Football royalty on your left, Franz Beckenbauer, great mate of Fedor Radman. I'll say no more except that everyone believes, almost everyone believes, that our one vote, which is what we got in the end for our $45 million, was from Franz Beckenbauer. I actually have a slightly different view on that, but Franz Beckenbauer, Fedor Radman and Andreas Abold's relationship going back to the German bid and before that is instructive. Amos Adamu, remember him? Suspended also. Someone so important to the Australian bid that a whole posse of people went to Nigeria. We threw a wonderful event at the Australian High Commission in Abuja, and there were differing reports about whether Amos Adamu in fact was actually at the events, but in fact he was at 2, and we met twice with him. Who knows what was discussed. Nicholas Laos and Hani Abu Rida. Nicholas, one of the things that all bidders did is they played some really interesting friendly games during the bid, and some are still playing out their promises now if you look around the bidding nations. We played Paraguay, in October 2010. We played Egypt in November 2010. It was all part of what you do as a bidder to get a vote, supposedly. And of course, the great 3. Mohammed bin Hammam was Peter Hargitay's brother. That's how close they were. He kept saying that. Jack Warner is Peter Hargitay's best buddy. Don't need to tell you what's happened to Mohammed bin Haman and Jack Warner. And of course, Sepp Blatter, Peter Hargitay was his special advisor and still is, I believe. But wait, there's more, and I've got to hurry because I've got a yellow card for time. Who's this man? Besides being Frank Lowy, it's Nurdin Halid. Who's Nurdin Halid? He's the ex-president of the Indonesian Football Association. Some of you may not recall that Indonesia was a bidder. But in February 2010, within days of my contract being terminated, we had signed an agreement with Indonesia for cooperation. A few months afterwards, they dropped out of the bid race. A few months after that, Nurdin Halid, who had been running the Indonesian Football Association from jail, turned up holding the hand of Australia at the Congress in June 2010 in South Africa. Pearls. If you haven't already heard the Pearl story, and because we're running out of time, I'll just say, read the excerpts from my book that's on transparencyinsport.org. Cyprus. Everybody loves Cyprus. Not only do one of our consultants have their head offices there, but we paid for the under-20 team of Trinidad and Tobago, guess who comes from Trinidad and Tobago, to go to Cyprus for a camp prior to the under-20 World Cup. Wasn't that generous of us? Why? That's $500,000 US. That's how much Jack Warner pocketed. I'm not saying that, although I did know it, or did guess it, sorry. The Committee of Integrity of CONCACAF has said that the Australian bid gave Trinidad and Tobago $500,000, which Jack Warner pocketed. Do you know that I'm about the only person in Australia who actually cares about it? I'm the only one who's actually asked the question, why did we do that? Why did we ever think that Jack Warner, who was then the president of CONCACAF, was going to vote for us? Because our consultants had convinced us somehow that they were going to give us their second vote when the US dropped out. And last but not least, we gave $2.5 million to Jamaica. Jamaica, they don't have a vote, but they are great buddies with one of our bid consultants. They are great buddies with Jack Warner. And there's an FFA official, our consultant, the Jamaican sports minister and the Jamaican FA president signing to a cooperation agreement with $2.5 million more. So we're now up to 52.5 of Australian taxpayers' money. And after all that, I was just going to play the bit where we found out that we got one vote. That's it, that's my 12 minutes. It doesn't answer any questions, but I hope it raises some questions in your mind. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Bonita, for this insider's perspective on the Australian bid and their disappointment. Of course, having been to Sydney as one of my Olympic Games, I can only echo that. I'm sure that it would have been a wonderful event if, in the end, the Australian bid had come out the winner, but that's not what happened. Now, it's almost a perfect lead-in to our next speaker, Tim Walters from Canada. He is listed here as an English professor from somewhere near Vancouver, British Columbia, and he assures me that, well, it's not really part of his workload to be immersed in the world of FIFA and the bidding for World Cup soccer, but soccer isn't a passion of him, even as a player, he tells me. But certainly this is a topic that he has given a lot of attention. And it's going to get a particular twist, both the first part talking about the bidding process and in a very appropriate way, looking ahead, what does the outcome of the bids for 2018 and 22 really mean for the future of FIFA and the hope for reform. And he is doing something as usual as bringing in the theories of a Slovenian philosopher, Slavoj Žižek, to illustrate what it might take to achieve a turnaround. So with those comments, Tim, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction. Because I'm writing a book about a Slovenian philosopher, unfortunately, I don't have any nice pictures of Nicole Kidman for any of you today, which would have been better. It's my hope today to make a case for using the theories of Slovenian Marxist philosopher Slavoj Žižek to assess the need for reform of FIFA, an organization whose reputation is rightly, I think, at an unprecedented low. I will use the controversial decision to award the 2018 and 2022 World Cup finals to Russia and Qatar respectively as being emblematic of the myriad problems that beset world football governance today. This widely criticized moment inaugurated a period of intense public criticism and marks a turning point of historical significance for FIFA. Coming in the wake of the contested awarding of these tournaments in late 2010, I contend that Brazil 2014 will be the last World Cup of the sort with which we have become familiar. A tournament that is indicative of FIFA's apparent willingness to subordinate all other considerations, the lives of workers, the social impact on the citizens of host nations, the quality of football that is played, etc., to the economic bottom line. The nearly 2 million protesters at the Confederations Cup this summer have made choosing another type of tournament, one which is not a mechanism for privatizing profit and socializing debt, another type of FIFA, almost inevitable. As Edward Galeano recently argued, quote, Brazilians, who are the most soccer mad of all, have decided not to allow their sport to be used anymore as an excuse for humiliating the many and enriching the few. Next summer, during the finals proper, we can expect much more of the same. Wave after wave of protest that dramatize people's outrage with what the beautiful game has been made into on its biggest stage of all. So how then might Žižek help us theorize these troubles? While he writes about almost everything but football, his models of cultural critique can be easily translated from the world in general to the world of football, since both spheres share similar and I think related problems. It's first worth noting, somewhat depressingly, I think, that nothing about the 2018-2022 World Cup hosting process was substantially atypical, nor was the decision itself particularly illegitimate. It was in fact business as usual in the context of FIFA's dismal modus operandi. However, because so many people felt that the decisions that were arrived at appeared egregious, so clearly motivated by considerations other than footballing ones, so directly contradictory to FIFA's mission statements, that we need to think about this organization and this process in a new way. The institutional commitment to commercialization and spectacle at any cost initiated during the Havelange era and accelerated under President Blatter's tenure appeared to reach its apogee at this moment, particularly with the Qatar decision. An organization that selects a host nation approximately the same size as Aarhus and with fewer actual citizens, which has no notable footballing tradition, no evidence of a lively footballing culture, which is indeed climatologically incompatible with either playing or watching football, and whose only real claim to international fame is the oil wealth buried beneath its surface, can hardly seriously claim to be for the game or for the world. Russia, too, seems to many a dubious choice, and for many of the same reasons. Its geographical incompatibility with the tournament, its devastating and worsening social inequalities, its abysmal human rights record, its negligent public interest in domestic football, and last but definitely not least, the massive and massively concentrated profits derived from its oil and natural gas reserves. Russia and Qatar also shared the dubious distinction of being the two most operationally risky nations by FIFA's own bid evaluation group. So how then to account for the strangeness of this moment, which seemed at once to stun the sporting world, and yet was precisely what one might expect given the players involved? Žižek's particular conception of ideology is useful here. He has risen to prominence as the leading exponent of the, quote, good, old-fashioned, half-forgotten art of the critique of ideology. One of his favorite ways of defining this idea is to build upon an example provided by the great American philosopher, as he calls him, Donald Rumsfeld, in 2002. While attempting to suggest Saddam Hussein's possession of unimaginably terrifying weapons of mass destruction, Rumsfeld advanced an infamous theory of knowledge. He said, there are known knowns. There are things that we know that we know. There are known unknowns. That is to say, there are things that we know we don't know. But there are also unknown unknowns. There are things we don't know we don't know. Žižek continues, quote, What he forgot to add was the crucial fourth term, the unknown knowns, the things we don't know that we know. The main dangers lie in the unknown knowns, disavowed beliefs, suppositions, and obscene practices we pretend not to know about, even though they form the background of our public lives. Ideology for Zizek is these unknown knowns, which constitute the parameters of our thinking in socially useful ways and limit our comprehension of cultural phenomena. The critical question then for Zizek is, what do we not know that we know about football? Certainly today, almost everyone, and certainly I think everyone in this room, is aware that all is not well in the footballing world. That secret is out. The majority of the mainstream media today assume the existence of a cynical viewer who believes the elite game is being made worse by money in various ways. So how can football abide such critique and still flourish? Another Zizekian notion is useful here, the idea of the Denkverbot, or prohibition against thinking beyond certain ideologically determined boundaries. Zizek argues that, unlike other systems of rule which limit free speech to contain dissent, our contemporary social order is unusually predicated on a healthy degree of public critique, which paradoxically sustains the system rather than undermining it. Quote, in short, it means say and write whatever you like, on condition that you do not actually question or disturb the prevailing political consensus. Everything is allowed, solicited even as a critical topic. The problem is that all this occurs against a background of a fundamental Denkverbot, a prohibition on thinking in ways that might lead to engaging in political projects which aim seriously to challenge the existing order. What then is the Denkverbot as regards the problem of FIFA, and what are the acceptable limits of reformist thinking? Primarily, it seems to me that we place too great a hope on the possibility of democratic reform, both in terms of changes to personnel or to structural governance problems. While changes in these areas are positive to be sure and will make things better in some ways, for Zizek the problem is at bottom an economic one. We ought to stop characterizing what is fundamentally a problem of economics as primarily one of governance, since doing so leads us first to consider democratic solutions rather than economic ones. The problems at FIFA and the current issues with World Cup planning are principally economic in character. The organization has chosen to conform itself to the demands of global capitalism, to model itself as a transnational corporation, and to behave accordingly. No institution that defines itself in this way could do significantly otherwise, regardless its democratic structure or its internal politics. Indeed, counterintuitively, many of the problems besetting FIFA today might actually be understood as democratic in origin. Blatter's much criticized tenure, as well as that of his predecessor, has been facilitated by his manipulation of the organization's no doubt well-intended democratic mechanisms. He exerts control over the organization by virtue of his electoral mastery of its primary decision-making body, the Executive Committee. He has been successful in multiple election bids, and perhaps will be again in a few years, due to his shrewd manipulation of FIFA's one country, one vote policy, which, while theoretically admirable, is disastrous in practice. Even the controversial Qatar and Russia decisions were arguably triumphs of democratic decision-making rather than subversions of it. They were chosen in a free election and have been defended, as was the World Cup in South Africa, precisely as reflecting a righteous desire that all member states and confederations should be equally able to host the finals, not just traditional European footballing superpowers. The fundamental ideological problem then for Zizek is not one of a paucity of democracy, but rather of an excess of capitalism, which has wound itself deep into the DNA of elite football in general and FIFA in particular. Nearly all of the problems that blight FIFA at the moment are expressions of the fact that they seem motivated primarily by profit, and are really only problems if you do not accept the premise that this is what FIFA is really for. This helps explain the bemusement of so many at the news of the 2018-2022 allocations, and it helps explain the spontaneous social movement against the tournament in Brazil last summer. For decades, FIFA has elected to run football, world football, like a business. The only thing that has really changed is the extent to which this is the case. Despite its increasingly unconvincing claims to be for the game, for the world, if the answer to the existential question, what is football for, is in actuality nothing more than for profit, then problems such as those we are experiencing today are inevitable regardless of who is in charge or what governance structure is adopted. A focus on politics over economics is apparent in most proposed reforms of FIFA, many of which present themselves as sweeping yet remain within this ideological framework. Despite a wealth of critique of the corrosive effects of capital on football, there still remains the underlying assumption that we can alter football's governance structure and in so doing have our cake and eat it too. We can retain all of the spectacular advantages we like about the game today while doing away with its capitalist excesses. Zizek's concern would be that only those solutions which would change things by not really changing them are considered, and solutions which lie outside the sphere of capitalist ideology are rejected at the outset. For Zizek, put simply, all proposals to rid football or our culture of the negative effects of capital from entirely within the capitalist horizon are ultimately doomed to fail. A utopian faith in capitalism's ability to correct itself or to be reined in democratically is everywhere apparent in critical football ideology, and certainly in the range of solutions which bear serious discussion. For Zizek, this focus is diversionary, and he would have us remember that if we are interested in changing these worlds in the long term and for the better, then we must focus on the financial system itself rather than those who may exploit it. For Zizek, capitalism will always concentrate resources unfairly, will always arrange power unequally. Far from being a flaw of the system which can be corrected with better governance or different leadership, the desire to move more and more money through the game is the very engine of capital itself, its driving mechanism, which will always find ways to override any attempts to contain it. He reminds us of Bertolt Brecht's injunction to, quote, change the system, not individuals. But the system that needs changing in football is primarily economic rather than political. Zizek counsels, quote, in football we win if we obey the rules. In politics we win if we have the audacity to change the rules. This means rethinking what elite football might look like if it were governed by non-capitalist principles and for non-capitalist ends, which is to say, imagining what football might be for if it was not for money. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Very interesting perspective. Reminds us that although we are talking about the same processes, the same problems, that yes, we need to look at the people involved, but we also need to look at the underlying systemic issues, the underlying basic philosophies that govern how the business of football at the highest level is run and what that does to the sport and to the participants, stakeholders, bidding countries, and so on. I think we should slightly move away from this focus on football for just one segment of our session and talk about more broadly the issue that I think our next speaker, Bastien Wallace, would say is the key word, integrity. Here, you know, we have sessions that are on governance, that are on sports betting and match fixing, that are on drug use and doping. And I think, given her background in sports, in public health, in fitness and well-being, and now her position as a national educational manager in Basketball Australia, she ties it all together, because there she is focusing on the whole spectrum, and rather than dealing with these different aspects one at a time and finding solutions for each of them, basically arguing that it all comes together in terms of educating and dealing with the overall concept of integrity. So with those words, welcome up, Bastien.
Okay, I'm going to begin, and thank you very much for having me, incidentally. I'm going to begin with a definition of integrity, because we speak very often as though it's a known, that we kind of assume what a definition is about. but I'm using the definition developed by the National Integrity of Sport Unit in Australia, namely the manifestation of ethics and values which promote community confidence in sport, including the fair, honest performances and outcomes unaffected by illegitimate enhancements or external interests, and the positive conduct by athletes, administrators, officials, supporters and other stakeholders on and off the sporting arena, which enhances the reputation and standing of the sporting context. I'm going to argue that short-term focuses on vice are simply not enough, that success lies in taking a thorough and consistent approach to strengthening and maintaining the integrity of sport. I'm convinced there is too much at stake to fail. Having initiatives around drugs or alcohol, violence or gender discrimination, having sports the ability to pick and choose between whether or not they take up these various issues of integrity or simply choose to leave them. I'm going to argue that that just isn't good enough for a long-term success. Now, I come from Newcastle, a coastal city in Australia, which is known for coal, beaches, a university, and being really close to good vineyards. I didn't begin as a sporty child. I was small and uncoordinated, but I've always loved the beach and loved to swim, so it was no surprise that I put myself through my university education by teaching swimming. That enabled me to fund a passion that I developed for aerobics and my only world-class medals in that sport, but it also gave me an entrance into surf lifesaving. And I guess one of the great joys for me is sharing my passion for sport, teaching others to swim, helping them to participate and be healthy. And whether it's helping an old person to get back up off the floor when they've fallen down, or a little child who's terrified to swim, these are the things that have motivated me on the participation side of sport. Now, like a lot of Australians, I left Australia for my big adventure and I went to the United Kingdom. And they decided that with my experience and my degree, I would be good at managing leisure facilities. And turns out I was, surprisingly. And I moved quickly from managing centres to leading projects that were about creating change and improvement in services and technology, or in attendance and engagement, particularly by communities that most needed to use services. So people at risk of the diseases of inactivity, people for whom their refugee status, age, disability had become barriers to participation in sport and physical activity. For me, that was absolutely brilliant, but I started to ask questions. I wanted sport, health and fitness to deliver all of the great stuff that I loved. And instead, I and my staff were being put at risk and injured by unsafe equipment and work practices. I was being used as cut-price night security to clear burglars out of facilities. I had staff being burnt by unlagged boilers. I had to cope with the endless sexism and job insecurity that the handful of female managers at my level faced. And then there were the unethical recruitment and financial mismanagement practices. The worst part for me is there was nobody to tell. If I sought change, I was putting my job prospects at risk. You see, leisure trusts were formed in the United Kingdom to save money. And to do this, the operators took over and they cut costs by cutting things like staff wages. They kept the facilities beautiful where the public could see, but they cut down on the safety equipment and the plant and equipment that the staff had to manage. Is this a peculiarly British problem? No, I'm afraid not. In Australia, we have problems around staff on the sharp end of delivering sport and recreation services, not having had a pay rise for 15 years. Do the professional organisations serve at all to help people? No, they make you pay a membership fee to pay for insurance or music licensing, but they do nothing to protect staff. In order to play sport, people in the community need to learn how. To be physically active, they need the facilities in which they can participate, and they need the workers who keep them running. Companies claiming to be all about health and wellness are actually dependent on practices that leave their staff poor and unhealthy, and on revenue models that rely on a large proportion of the people paying for their facilities not actually coming to participate. What's the impact on sport? Enthusiastic workers don't stay. and it's a nightmare trying to attract and retain graduates with the necessary skills to work in the roles that only offer poor pay and conditions. Eventually, opportunities to train for your sport and to play are lost, and the facilities are closed or replaced by things that cost less to run or are unsuitable to train and compete in. I stepped away from managing leisure facilities, and after a short stint in a global company, I took up a position with the governing body for aquatics in the United Kingdom, the Amateur Swimming Association. It was my job to transform the health of children in the London borough of Barking and Dagenham by getting them into pools and active and out of the chip shops and away from the other unhealthy behaviours that meant that they were expected to live 8.5 years less than their colleagues a 15-mile bike ride away in central London. I had the opportunity and £1.3 million over 2 years to take what was described as a failing borough and leisure service and to really create change. And I was really excited by that. Around 6 months later, as part of the Olympics legacy of increased participation in sport, the UK government launched a £140 million scheme allowing local councils to access funds if they would put on free swimming participation for under 16 and over 60s. Part of the money was to compensate the pool owners for their lost revenue in ticket sales, and the other part was to invest in improving what were really crumbling and ageing facilities. Now, the UK government really was investing a vast amount of money. It should have massively boosted swimming participation in England and been a real blessing for sport. Was swimming as a sport really ready for this kind of investment? The influx of non-swimmers? How about the expectation and the scrutiny that you could imagine would follow? Would 2 years be enough to transform public health? Were the councils and the peoples managing the pool really ready? Could they plan? When a borough is given only 13 days to decide whether their portion of funding will actually cover the bills, when compensation is calculated based on population, not the number of pools that you have to fix up or the revenue that you will lose, when no thought is given to the displaced ordinary customers in the already overcrowded pools, could the people who most needed to get active access this opportunity? A fundamental problem was that most of these people couldn't actually swim, and the plans didn't tackle that generally low level of ability. Did the politicians look for or ask any questions of the people who had data where they had tried free swimming schemes before? Did they look at Wales where they'd had test cases or other places in England? No. By the 31st of July 2010, only 16 months later, the free swimming scheme was cancelled and budget cuts were cited as the reason. But based on the PricewaterhouseCoopers report on the scheme, the Sport and Olympics Minister Hugh Robertson said, "The research shows that a great majority of the free swimmers were swimming already, and they would have paid to swim anyway." I guess from the inside of all of this, I saw the pressure that was applied to staff. I saw the poor levels of swimming ability in the overcrowded pools. I saw the inability of operators to achieve the miracles that government wanted. I did see the innovative efforts of my boss to get more lessons for non-swimmers, to get more swimming teachers trained, to get better business tools developed to help pool managers create sustainable businesses, and his efforts to forge relationships between competing pool operators for the benefit of all. Did this go down well with the leaders of sport? Not really. Instead, proactive staff were bullied out of the organisation, and the chance was lost to develop business intelligence and a sustainable increase in swimming participation. When a sport does not have its governance issues sorted out, successful leadership can get you the wrong sort of attention. Lots of money can really amplify problems, especially if you hand it to the wrong people and you don't hold them accountable for real change. This massive investment failed to return ongoing increases in participation or sustainable change. You see, sport has to be prepared for the opportunities and the threats, and it needs strong governance if it's going to handle the challenge that funding or even huge expenditure, otherwise it'll have no measurable difference. 106 years ago, Surf Life Saving Australia began as a volunteer organisation to prevent coastal drowning. I joined Dixon Park Surf Life Saving Club in 1998 and served for 5 years before I worked abroad. I returned in 2010 and I continue to patrol at Tamarama Surf Club, and I now row for North Cronulla. This organisation started out really simply, but over the years it's taken up the latest rescue equipment, it uses the best techniques, researches new technologies and machines to make rescues faster, to provide more efficient and effective first aid and resuscitation, and it delivers first-class training for volunteers. Lifesavers perform between 8,000 and 10,000 rescues annually, and we have a record of no lives lost between the flags. To get good at what we do, we practice a bunch of surf sports. Some of them started out pretty crazy, but now we row, run, swim, paddle and drive, so that when we're needed, we've got what it takes. But there's a tough culture of bravado that gets woven in amongst this that can be inspirational but also dangerous. Surf Life Saving has been challenged in the way it operates internally and the way it protects the safety of its members. This gentleman here is Robert Gatenby, and in 1996, aged 15, he died at the final of the National Under-18 Boat Race Championship at Kurrawa Beach. Over there you have Saxon Bird. He died in 2010 in the final of the Under-19 Ironman race at Kurrawa Beach. And in 2012, Matthew Barclay died racing at the same beach. What did these deaths have in common? Obviously the location. Obviously it was the national competition, but each death was attributed to head injuries, drowning, and the strong seas were mentioned as a factor. After the first death, Surf Life Saving made an investigation and discovered and published a report to say that helmets and flotation devices should have been used. In the subsequent 2 deaths, over a 16-year period, none of its own advice was followed. Volunteering for the clubs that I've been involved in and working at the head office of Surf Life Saving, if I had to say from my experience what the reason is for these problems, I'd say it has a lot to do with the double-edged sword of proud tradition. Since Matthew's death, Surf Life Saving has introduced high visibility vests for all competitors, and it has moved the annual competition from Kurrawa Beach. It's also announced that eventually we'll get helmets and life jackets, and I'm really pleased about that. But I'm afraid the macho culture of Surf Life Saving is something that I've been on the hard end of receiving, whether it's defending our members who come from different ethnicities, whether it's standing up for women's rights to be in the room and not just making the tea, or it's standing up for the attitudes that mean that even our paid staff have a very high turnover. It's something that's very dear to my heart, but something that we need to examine for ourselves. I've talked a lot about the problems, but I'm pleased to say that Australia is starting to do something in terms of working with the solutions. You've heard of our blackest day in sport. You've heard of drugs issues, integrity issues. I'm pleased to say that the Australian government is and has been conducting investigations into organised crime and the links to sport, and that it has acknowledged that there are problems we do need to deal with, that we have campaigns, and I get to work on one of them for the Illicit Drugs in Sport campaign. We have Be the Influence to tackle binge drinking, but we are starting to understand that we need to bring all of these things together and have proper good governance principles that nobody can back out of. And I'm very proud that we get the opportunity to do that. I believe we can't have governance as an optional idea, but also that sport is primarily positioned to be able to solve its own problems. If I lost a game, I wouldn't get to cover that up, it's public. My process after I have a loss is that I go to my coach and I learn what I'm supposed to do better the next time. We analyse it, we bring in experts if necessary. And I believe that if sport starts to take into the boardroom the lessons that it has on the pitch, in the pool, in the surf, and on the court, that we are actually primarily placed to be able to solve our own problems and to enforce the idea that integrity is not optional, that it's fundamental to everything we do and the foundation of everything that we will be.
Thank you very much, Bastien, by reminding us that governance is not just some theoretical or abstract concept, that it's something that is directly linked to the well-being of our athletes and our young generation, and that has very strong practical implications whether governance has integrity and whether it's functioning well. Our next speaker, Tolga Senel, brings us back to the world of soccer to some extent. He is coming to this business of sports via a master's degree at Birkbeck College. He was for 7-8 years involved in sports event management and communications in his home country of Turkey, and he's now on a freelance basis a project director and consultant in the area of sports marketing. Welcome up, Tolga.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm a regular attendant of Play the Game since 2007, and this will be the first time that something will be told about the Turkish sports, I imagine, and I see more people coming from my country, and I hope that this is a sign of increasing awareness on the need for better governance in Turkish sports. And in my presentation, at the beginning, I will talk about the autonomy of sports and legal protection provided to Turkish Football Federation by law. And then I will go to give you some examples of political influence in Turkish football. And in conclusion, I want to share my thoughts on what could be learned from the Turkish experience. And if you look at this picture, you will see the level of autonomy actually in Turkey. And the ones who their hands are folded are from Turkish Football Federation or Turkish Clubs Association, and the ones who their hands are free are from Sports Ministry. This is after a meeting between them in the Ministry of Sports a few months ago. And generally speaking, sports administrators are addicted to a phenomenon, the autonomy of sports, and they argue that the sports industry is unique and shall have privileges that no other industry enjoys. They want legal certainty and protection to better govern their sport. And UEFA describes an ideal world in their vision document as a football world where UEFA deals with all questions relating to European football, a future legal environment leading to legal certainty and full judicial recognition of the autonomy of sports structures and the specificity of sports. But welcome to more than ideal world, which is Turkey in this sense. Turkish Football Federation granted autonomy legally in 1992. We can say that theoretically they received autonomy. And Şener Erzik is the last appointed and first elected president of the Football Federation. And with current legislation, Turkish Football Federation has the right and duties to organize and regulate all football activities within Turkey, to promote the development and expansion of football in Turkey, and to ensure that all members of football comply with the statutes, regulations, and directives set forth by FIFA, UEFA, and Turkish Football Federation. And these articles I took directly from the original translation of Turkish law. And there are even some more than this. And in the Constitution of Turkey, this paragraph is directly taken from there. In 17 March in 2011, this article basically says you cannot go to public courts against the decision of a sports governing body. You can only appeal to the arbitration committee of the association or to CAS, if relevant. This is even valid for most of the economic decisions made by sports governing bodies. For example, about TV rights, player contracts, or number of sponsors on your shirt, etc. But football is still ruled by politics. These kind of legal protection didn't make any difference in the autonomy of sports. For example, this is a regular scene from Turkish football. Sports minister signing 2 new players from Samsunspor a few months ago. The gentleman here in the middle is the sports minister. And Samsun is his hometown and electoral district of Mr. Suat Kılıç. If you look at the stadiums, they all are owned by Ministry of Sports, all major stadiums in Turkey. And those are constructed by the ministry as well. So if you look at in the last 10 years, mainly most of them are being built or started in the last 3 years. And this is a map that the major stadium investments going on in Turkey. And it is not possible to see on this map how the investment decisions were made by the government. It's not the level of interest in sport or football, not the level of wealth, or the number of football clubs in a city. It's mainly what's happened in the 2011 general elections. So there is no stadium construction going or started in the regions who didn't vote for the current government. Even if they are very much interested in football, and some cities are a really big tradition in football, but they never received such a investment. And if you go to leagues, Sport Toto Super League's naming sponsor, Sport Toto, is the national sports betting monopoly. They are also sponsored to 14 clubs in the league out of 18, and distributing also money from sports betting. This year they will distribute $105 million to all clubs out of their sponsorship distribution. And the broadcaster of the league, Digiturk, is now under control of the public bodies as well. It's a public institution now who is controlling the broadcaster. And if we go to other competitions, the other leagues, the situation is the same in lower leagues. It is broadcasted by the state's TV channel TRT and sports sponsored by the National Post Office or Sport Toto in lower leagues. Ziraat Bankası is a public bank and naming sponsor of the Turkish Cup. And the president of Turkish Football Federation had to get permission from Prime Minister to become a candidate. And according to many journalists, he was appointed, not elected actually. And a new type of football club is invented. This is municipality sport clubs. They almost have no fans, but plenty of sponsors and resources. Actually, this slide was changed. I had a different picture. You would see where the Istanbul Municipality Sports Club is playing in a 70,000 capacity stadium. They don't have even 100 fans coming to the games, and they have 31 sponsors, and 23 of them are public companies, and 8 are not known why they are backing a team without sponsor. And so if we look at the big picture, Turkish Football Federation, we can say, is controlled. Clubs are partly controlled. Stadiums, broadcaster are under control of some public institutions, and sponsors in many cases as well. And about fans, they couldn't do it, but it's coming soon. They are taking measures to control fans and control stadiums as well. So I will point you 2 cases to better explain what are these consequences of holding that the state is holding everything in hand. And I'm not saying this is a result of direct interfering in the match results, but the distribution of income and making political decisions at every level cause such a difference. For example, Altay Sports Club from Izmir has a secular fan base and most consistent football team of Izmir. And I must say, Izmir is one of the cities who didn't vote for AKP for a long time, didn't decide them as the first political party. And in between 1959, beginning of the professional leagues, to 2003, where current government came to power, the club was the fourth club in terms of participation in the top division after the top three clubs of Istanbul, even more than Trabzonspor, which is considered as the fourth big club in Turkey. And only 2 seasons without an Izmir team in top flight, and 4 seasons without Altay league was played in that 44 years. And they have never got relegated to third tier. And after that, in the last 10 years, they never played again in Super League, relegated to third tier league, and playing there in the last 3 seasons, including this season. And Kasımpaşa Football Club is a district in Istanbul where Tayyip Erdogan was born and raised. And they have a conservative fan base. And between 1959 and 2003, they never played in top tier since 1964. They were playing in the fourth tier league in 2002 and 3. And after that, in consecutive 5 seasons, they got promoted 4 divisions up. And a new home ground was built for them, which they named after Recep Tayyip Erdogan. And at the moment has one of the wealthiest sports in Turkish football. You can even compare the wealth of the board with Galatasaray or Fenerbahce. And in conclusion, what can we see in this example of Turkish football? Autonomy without good governance in practice may be useless or dangerous. And it's difficult to claim autonomy without economic independence or a culture of accepting and respecting autonomous institutions is more important than regulations. This is very important, I think. What I see in Europe, there's a culture of respect to autonomous institutions. And in Turkey, we have very, very strong laws that you can see that I believe that UEFA or FIFA would like to see on every country. But in the end, there is no autonomy that we can talk about. But in Europe, there is no such an exemption from law. But in the end, the sports governing bodies are more autonomous than they are in Turkey. Thanks for listening and your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Tolga. You know, sitting across the Atlantic every year, I wonder when I follow then the draw for the UEFA Champions League and Europe League, why is it that every year they have to wait and figure out that just before the draw or after the draw, whether one or the other of the Turkish clubs is eligible to participate or not, but may have something to do with some of the issues explained. And of course, I always also have to allow myself the reflection, well, when you hear about this kind of involvement, direction, shall we say, from the government, what one of the main champions of autonomy for sports and protection against political influence, our new IOC president, might think about this state of affairs. Anyway, we might get questions on that later on. Now our next speaker, we have, as a good tradition and for obvious reasons in Play the Games, one or the other of speakers from Transparency International with us. And this year's participant is Deborah Unger from the UK office, where she is in charge of the Rapid Reaction Unit, meaning whenever something happens of relevance to Transparency International in the world, that there has to be someone who in a well-articulated and appropriate way can go on record with a reaction on behalf of Transparency International. And of course that fits very nicely in with Deborah's background in journalism. She has been writing for a number of prestigious news media, Business Week, The Guardian, and The Times, and so on, before she came to Transparency International. I see here also that she is an Ipswich Town supporter. Must be a tough situation right now when it's Norwich that is in the Premier League and not poor Ipswich. But I hope if you're also Chelsea supporter, as it says here, that compensates somewhat. Welcome up, Deborah.
Good afternoon. Hope I can work this thing. Thank you very much to Play the Game for inviting me to speak. And my goal today is to talk about the evolution of Transparency International's engagement with anti-corruption in sport and why we think we can contribute to the debate. You've heard different aspects of governance today, some very exciting stories, outrageous stories, difficult stories. This may be slightly more on the mundane level because I'm going to talk about the tools and the solutions that we think we might be able to bring to the governance issue. Just a little bit of background. Transparency International is first and foremost a research-based advocacy organization that calls for change. We have a well-defined vision statement, some might say a rather bold one. It's a world free of corruption. And we look where we can forward that message and how we can move people to act. That means we look to find solutions and tools. And we've been doing it now for 20 years. This is our 20th anniversary year. And in that time, we have not only gathered experience on what works, but we have developed various ways to get the ball rolling in different areas as we move to different sectors. This gives our vision, and this gives some of the milestones in our life. And I'd like to talk a bit today about the tools and what they are and where they came from. And in the early days of the anti-corruption movement, the goal of the advocacy was, in a sense, simply to convince people that corruption was bad for a lot of people. It hurt development, it disadvantaged the poor, and it was not a victimless crime. And these were issues that people didn't talk about. Corruption was not on the international agenda in 1993, when a group of like-minded people gathered together in Berlin to start Transparency International. But what we wanted to say was that corruption could be tackled. Corruption was not business as usual. It was not politics as usual. It could be tackled. And in more than 10 years, in the beginning there, it took us 10 years, I should say, we got this message onto the international agenda. In 2003, both the UN and the OECD adopted conventions against corruption and bribery. And these conventions were also spread throughout the world. There's an Organization of American States has one, the African Union has one. And that means the entire world is covered by an anti-corruption legal framework. And we have chapters now in more than 100 countries. And their goal is to take aspects of this legal framework and push governments and organizations and corporations to enforce them. Because enforcement, as we can all see, is really where the story lies. It's not quite like Declan Hill's map, but anyway, we're all where the blue bits are. Now here are a look at some of our tools. Perhaps our most famous one, introduced in 1995 and from every year since, is the Corruption Perceptions Index. Now that is essentially a strong advocacy tool. It measures levels of perceived corruption in governments around the world in public sector corruption. Now, clearly you can't measure corruption all the way, so these are perceived levels of corruption. It's an aggregate poll of polls that we analyze, and we come up with a single number, and it's between 0 and 100, with 100 being clean and 0 being very, very corrupt. This allows journalists, it allows policymakers, it allows risk analysts to get some idea about the level of corruption in the countries, and it causes waves. People get angry at it. Academics get angry at it because they don't think it's very accurate. Governments themselves get angry at it because they don't like to get low scores. In fact, in the most recent ones, I have to say Russia was so angry they decided they'd do their own because they thought it would be better. And we pride ourselves in our independence. Here we have the bribe payers index. That looks at the likelihood of firms from the world's 20 plus industrialized countries to bribe abroad. It's the supply side of corruption. Who's giving the money, not who's taking it, who's likely to give the money. And then we have the TRAC report, the Transparency in Corporate Reporting, which in a sense is quite similar to the governance index that Play the Game has been talking about a lot. It looks at different aspects of corporate reporting and tries to assess how prepared companies are to fight corruption. It looks at the anti-corruption programs that they have in place. It looks at their organizational transparency, and it looks at their accounting reporting, mainly on a country-by-country basis. Now, this is part of our business integrity toolkit. We break down the problem of addressing corruption into these stages. And we have tools along the way of how you can address each of these stages. The one, commit, is rather interesting and very important. It's one that we stress very much. Commit to an anti-corruption program from the top. This is what we stress everywhere. The tone from the top is extremely important. You have to have buy-in from the very top. It was the same when we talked to FIFA, but that didn't quite work. And when we look at governance in organizations, we use a framework that was developed first in 2003 called the Business Principles for Countering Bribery. This was a very interesting and very useful tool because it looks at good business practices and risk management. And it helps break down the problem so that companies can develop anti-corruption programs. And this is what we actually used when we did come to talk about entering the world of corruption in sport and applying it to organizations like FIFA and the ICC in cricket and UCI in cycling. Here you can see a practical guide. You saw some of the principles in the Play the Game governance list. This is something that we would encourage companies to fill out. It's an anti-bribery checklist. It will show whether they have programs in place. It will chart how far along the way they are. It's just a practical tool. As I say, a lot of the battle that we have is providing practical tools for people to get moving on instituting anti-corruption programs. And we have guidance on what would be best practice within organizations. And this guidance takes different forms. The anti-bribery guidance for transactions, it will break down different stages. It's a risk mapping tool. Resist extortion and solicitation in international transactions is something that can be applied in different areas. Resist is a case study kind of tool. It will give you actual situations, and it will actually help people know what to say, what to do, if they are confronted by difficult ethical situations. And the resist approach is one that we adapted for work in match fixing, and tomorrow I'm going to talk a little bit more about that when I talk about our Staying On Side project, and that we're working with DFL and the EPFL, and how Transparency Germany was involved with that as well, and how we're trying to spread that out into different European leagues. So, in 2009, we published our first working paper on corruption in sport. And it laid out general principles of applying anti-corruption tools and solutions to sport. It covered all the basic bases: match fixing, organized crime, governance, the transfer market, construction risks of big events, bidding, sponsorship, the media, and outlined what we could bring to the party. I talked about how we could use anti-corruption toolkit that I've been mentioning and apply it to sport. We're in the process of updating that at the moment. 2 years later, we started our engagement, our limited engagement in the reform process at FIFA, and we put together Safe Hands. We'd been out there in the press saying FIFA were bad, FIFA weren't doing anything, FIFA had been corrupt in some of its business. And we thought, well, we're a solutions organization. Maybe we should just put together a framework, a plan, hand it to them and see what they said. Engage them in the process. Well, that's what we tried to do. We had to pull out, as probably many of you know, because we didn't agree with the level of independence they wanted to give the reform process. And one of our recommendations had broadly fallen into two categories: the need for credible investigations into the past as a means of winning back trust, because trust totally lacking, as we all know. And you need to implement strategies in the future and have sufficient oversight to be credible, and for that you need independence. And FIFA were not really prepared to do that. So we pulled out. In the next couple of weeks, we're actually going to be publishing another one of these, and it's going to be called Fair Play, and it's taking together our recommendations for reforms for the International Cricket Council, who have gone through a big reform process, have lots of reports telling them what to do, and we're isolating things that we think they ought to do immediately. So these are some of the areas we've been involved in recently. The International Anti-Corruption Conference in Brazil in 2012 had a sports stream where we talked about many of these issues. The OECD High-Level Anti-Corruption Conference, we've been involved with that. UN Global Compact Guidelines on Sports Sponsorship and Hospitality, they are about to come out, I think, soon, and we're involved with that. MINEPS 5, we were also there. EU Expert Group on Good Governance, and the Global Reporting Initiative in the Event Sector Supplement. We also lent our expertise to that. And these are the areas where any of these tools could really be applied. We're also writing something that's called the Global Corruption Report that comes out almost annually, but not always annually, and we take big areas to have a look at what is the current thinking in anti-corruption in these areas and the state of play. We've covered the judiciary, we've covered climate finance, we've covered all sorts of areas. The last one that was just come out in October is about education. The next one is going to be on sport. And one of the reasons I'm here is that it's in the planning stages. We're looking for authors, and we're developing content. So people have ideas, and people think they can contribute. We'll be very, very happy to hear from you. So for more information on all of this, for downloading everything, please go to www.transparency.org and make use of our tools, criticize them if you want, have a look at them, give us your feedback. It's been a great pleasure talking to you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Deborah. I'm sure that for everyone here, it was the most useful reminder about how one of our most reliable partners in our efforts, Transparency International, is functioning in the field of sports. Our final speaker of this session is Daniel Chung, and as you see in the program, from Paraguay, but as the name might give you a hint of, with sort of an origin in Korea. He is working as a sports reporter, commentator for Radio Cardinal in Paraguay. And he has a very interesting story to share with us. You know, we are looking for the opportunity to provide incentives for good governance. and for rewards for people who, in the field of governance in sports, really doing a very job. I think this may be one of the unique cases. It's not something that we can hold out to everyone in a sports federation in a county, that if you really do a fantastic job and we trust you and you set a good example for governance, that you can become our president of the country. But that is, in any case, what happened in Paraguay, and I think we want to hear more about that. So welcome up, Daniel.
Okay, good afternoon. There's nothing wrong in the program sheet. Next to my name, it says Paraguay. As you can see, I'm the prototype of a Latin American male. For those of you that never heard of Paraguay, it's not in Asia, like Chris said. I'm Korean. I was born in South Korea, and I moved in a very early age to Paraguay, and I'm living there, so I consider it my country. And from this tiny country, I'm bringing a particular story. I don't know if we can label as a good example or bad or a nasty one. I was speaking to Deborah, and I was telling her that Paraguay is always in the bottom of her ranking. In the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index, Paraguay is 150th out of 176 countries. In 2000, in Paraguay, speaking about Horacio Cartes, was speaking basically about a mysterious person, owner of a dark and confusing past. He has spent 60 days in jail during a currency fraud investigation in 1986, and he was named in the WikiLeaks report last year of money laundering. This man is a very successful businessman. He has company from soft drinks, banks, and tobacco. But he became known because he was the less known person from a group that took charge of the football club Libertad, a very traditional club in Paraguay. But in that moment, they were in a discouraging sports moment, even relegated in the second division of the local league. In only 5 years of administration, he got rid of his former partners and became the president of the club. And he turned this club to the most winning team of the last decade. Libertad had won from 1905 to 2000 8 titles in the history of Paraguayan football. Under Cartes' administration, they added another 8 only in 12 years. The last one, last year. In 2005, during the celebration of the centenary anniversary of the club, he remodeled the stadium with the best illumination system in the country and doubling the capacity from 5,000. I told you this is not the most popular team, but with a very long tradition. Double the capacity from 5,000 to 10,000. And he renamed the stadium, which a name that probably is familiar to you, Dr. Nicolás Leos. Well, Nicolás Leos, I saw in this report, and I remember that we were wondering too why we were playing Australia. But yeah, she gave a very good answer. Nicolás Leos, by then the president of CONMEBOL, he's a former president of this club Libertad. In that time, it was very good received. Why? Because the name of the stadium was Alfredo Stroessner. I don't know if you know this guy. He was also a fan of this club Libertad. We can say coincidence or not, Stroessner, Leos, and now Cartes. So his success at this club made him a very strong man in the football world. he encouraged the current president of the Paraguayan FA and vice president of CONMEBOL, Juan Ángel Laput, to go for the main chair. And he took his coach, the man he discovered as a coach, Gerardo Tata Martino, the current coach of Barcelona Football Club, to the national team. And the rest is a very good story in the Paraguayan football society. He took to an unprecedented quarterfinal in the last World Cup, losing for a very narrow margin to the champion Spain. The national team gave him the popularity from the majority of sports fans, since Libertad is far away from being one of the most popular. The name of Cartes was a synonym of successful, good administration. After South Africa's World Cup with his political ambition set, he chose the most traditional political party in Paraguay. Not the other way. He wasn't chosen by the political party. He chose to be the candidate of the Partido Colorado, a centennial party where practically most presidents came out from this political association. There was a requirement. You needed to be 10 years associated. He just changed it. And he said, okay, from now on, you need to be 1 year associated. And he got all the votes. And last April, overcoming basically all the experts' prediction, he won the election by a very important margin, 46% to 37%, almost 10% of difference, according to the official research. Not bad for someone who voted for the first time in his life. That's how that's how the civic life of his was. Many factors can be analyzed in that presidential victory, but nobody can ignore the positive image he got from his time in sport. In third world countries such as Paraguay, where according to the annual report of CEPAL, Economic Commission of Latin America and Caribe, 49.6% live in poverty. The impact of sport goes beyond the pitch or an economic boost. It creates an image. It's not a coincidence that the last two presidents of Paraguay, they're coming from the church, former President Fernando Lugo, and from football, Horacio Cartes. The world talks about Nicolás Leo's late corruption cases. Doing it there in Paraguay is almost a taboo, because they, as society, understand that people from the exterior are attacking the image that was created around the former president of CONMEBOL, who has done so much good for the country, because the building of the headquarters is in Asunción. Well, that's how most people think. Carter still could be one of the wealthiest and powerful men in the country had he not entered in the world of sport. But he would never have been what he is now, the president of the country. It is the power of sport. A good administration based on successful research has projected an image that made people believe in him. And in countries with desperate needs such as jobs, security issues, a good management of football seems to fulfill all those needs. The conclusion leads me into a quite simple equation. Good sport administration means successful result, and it gives you unimaginable power. No wonder why so many countries that cannot satisfy basic needs of its people are candidates and potential hosts of mega events. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Not to make light of a serious topic, but one almost gets tempted to proclaim Viva la Libertad. Anyway, we have time up to 4 o'clock for some questions to our 6 speakers. So, who is ready to go first here? James?
Hi, I have 2 questions for Tolga Bey. Sorry, James Dorsey. One is, can you talk a little bit about the politics involving the match-fixing scandal, particularly with regard to Fenerbahce? And perhaps you could also speak a little bit about the involvement of 1453 within the Beşiktaş fan base.
Actually, first thing, the politics involved in match fixing. What was discussed, I can say, because there's no real evidence. But as you wrote in your blog as well, and many people say that this was a fight between a religious group and the current government, which were interconnected, which for many people was thinking they were always working together, and they were fighting through football. Many people say that, but there is no evidence on that. And in the media, very few people could mention this connection. And one of the most detailed articles were written by you, actually, and many Turkish journalists read from you rather than from Turkish newspapers. And probably you know better than me about that connection, because I'm more on the sports side, and I know more the sports administration side than the political issues. But about the 1453, for many people, these people think that this is a made-up fan group to curb the power of Çarşı fans of Beşiktaş. And there are very good evidences to think of that, because I even checked their Facebook, Twitter pages, and they didn't have any tweets before the beginning of September. And just after 2 weeks, an incident happened at a Beşiktaş game. So, and no one knew about them. Actually, I'm in the football business for a very long time. I never heard of that fan group before in the last 2-3 months. So, and they because Çarşı is so popular now and had so much influence in Gezi protests, which were very strong protests against the current government. And this group came from out of Beşiktaş, out of nowhere, we can say, from Beşiktaş stands. And now there are like thousands of people coming together on Twitter or Facebook, and they are more conservative, which is not very common among Beşiktaş fans. They are more secular, considered as secular fan base. So this is a very controversial issue, and just like the first thing, there is no real evidence on that. But if you ask me if this is a made-up fan group, I think so. It's highly likely to be so.
Okay.
And that's another thing. Actually, I put there was a Çarşı flag in my presentation. Actually, this issue is very long. That's why I didn't want to involve it in 12 minutes speech. And on that flag, which is in a AKP meeting, just after Gezi protests, and they even didn't know the logo of the fan group. They wrote it wrong. The font was wrong, and everyone could understand that was a fake flag. But they came with all those flags to AKP meeting, and after that they saw that this type of involvement doesn't work. Probably, maybe they decided to make up a fan group.
Okay. Any other topics? Any other speaker you would want to follow up with? In the back, think I see a face I recognize there in the last row.
In the back, indeed.
Yes.
2
modest.
points. One to Bonita. It seems pretty clear evidence that Jack Warner, probably with his bagman who was being paid by him as well as Australia, Peter Hargitay, were involved in stealing nearly $500,000 from Australian football. Why are the Australian police not investigating and seeking to extradite and to put these people on trial in Australia for just clear theft? And secondly, to Bastien and Wallace, thank you very much for a quite heart-rending list of horrors. Coming to the UK experience, isn't a lot of that down to the privatisation of sports facilities for profit, and thus the reduction of wages, the reduction of care, driving those facilities just for profit?
Look, I think there's no appetite in government in the United Kingdom to scrutinise the governing bodies of sport or the managers of leisure. There is nobody to complain to. When you are injured or burnt or hounded out of your job for highlighting the problems, there's nowhere to go because it's a heck of a lot cheaper to string people out to dry. It's not just the private, it's the leisure trust, it's the not-for-profit, it's the council-owned facilities and the private. They're all playing the same game, and they're all playing a game of how much can we continue to erode the workers' conditions to the point where I refer to jobs in the leisure industry as kiddie jobs, because you have to stay living at home with mum and dad to afford to do the work.
And to answer your question, Andrew, it's a million-dollar question, really. Why isn't the not the Australian Federal Police pursuing it? I think there are a number of issues around it. One, Football Federation Australia hasn't actually admitted that it was bid money, so they're deliberately, with our journalists who don't really want to pursue it anyway, they're deliberately trying to make it murky about whether it was bid, i.e. taxpayers' money, or FFA money, forgetting in fact that a whole lot of their revenue comes from taxpayers and another 7.5% comes from every little kid who plays. So there's that issue. They're deliberately making it murky. They're, of course, throwing up the Michael Garcia investigation and whether that may be looking at it. And at the end of the day, I guess maybe the truth may be uncomfortable. The fact is I was sacked from the job because I kept saying to my boss and his boss, who was the president of the FA, that the things that we were getting involved in was set up for exactly what happened. There was no control, and this gets back to the FIFA guidelines. There was no control when you're giving money to a country for development purposes. There was no control on whether someone clipped the ticket on the way through. And the Committee of Integrity of CONCACAF says that's exactly what happened in the Jack Warner case, and it's no surprise. And I don't know, I can only speculate, but perhaps FFA would prefer that no one actually knows about that. And you know, neither the government nor the opposition, even when they were reversed a few months ago, want to pursue it.
This will be in your book, won't it?
Yes.
Yeah, up front here we have.
Yes, thanks. Ezequiel Fernandez Murs from La Nación, Argentina. To Daniel Chung. Daniel, can you tell us what's about Nicolas Leo's life now? Is he still refusing that he received money from ISL?
The funny thing is, well, he's retired. He doesn't give interviews, but the problem is nobody's asking. Let me tell you what happened in the last press conference in CONMEBOL headquartered. He was saying, okay, I'm retiring because I'm sick. And after that, no journalist, there was a single question about ISL. They all followed. Oh, so you're retiring because you're sick? Is there a lot of pressure from FIFA? And when he finished the conference, there was a round of applause. believe it or not. I was in my radio booth, and I could only reach the secretary, Francisco Figueredo Brites. And I asked him, is he resigning because of ISL? Oh, we don't know that. Like in today's workshop, they said, they don't even give you the answer for the obvious. But that's something we're so used to in Latin America or Africa or some countries in Asia. Nothing happens. I mean, life goes on. And I mean, Libertad's field is still named after Leos. He's living in a very comfortable style. That's the reality in our countries.
Anybody else? Here up front.
It's a question to Mr. Walters. It's a bit difficult to pose a question to you because you were speaking through Slavoj Žižek a bit. But essentially, you were saying that as long as we act in the patterns of capitalism, we can do what we want, but we will essentially be doomed to fail. And that's what Mr. Chung just said. I mean, we're used to that. We're used to that, and that's what Mrs. Mersiades said when she said she's the only person in Australia who's interested in that. How depressed just are you about the state of sports? Just to you, Mr. Walters, and maybe to the others.
How depressed am I? How depressed is there? I'll answer the way that I think Žižek would also. He's a more optimistic character than I am. I think he's in line with a group of contemporary philosophers, this kind of growing body of major philosophers working today who are trying to reinvigorate the idea of communism, not in the sense of 20th century European failed experiments in state communism, but as a kind of ideal to aspire to, as a way of moving out of a capitalist framework. And I think the thing that is unique about football as a industrial sector, if you want to think about it in those terms, is that it's a huge source of surplus value. FIFA, I think, as an organization, are a particularly good example of this, in that they seem to contribute almost nothing to World Cup tournaments, yet somehow walk away with several $1 billion. Because they contribute very little, those resources are easily redirected. So it seems to me that football, at the top level anyway, has a unique capacity to bring about positive change in the world. So Žižek would be optimistic, I think.
Can I make a comment?
Please, Deborah.
I think that what we were all talking about was governance in different aspects of the sport, and the optimism that good governance could bring to the sporting world. And I know that why Transparency International wants to get involved more with the area of sport is very much because of the message that sport brings to a lot of people. When you want to fight corruption in the world, you want to reach a lot of people. And through sport, you can reach a lot of people. But sport is not a perfect environment. And you can help mold that environment into something that is better by introducing ideas of good governance and trying to enforce ideas of good governance in there. And then you can reach more people to talk about messages that sport should give anyway, the rules of the game, fair play, integrity. So I would say that we should be optimistic about introducing these ideas of good governance into sport. We should continue banging on about this, and that we shouldn't give up. We shouldn't say that it's become such a big business and there are so many bad elements in there, so many ugly elements, to take the title from this session. So I would encourage everybody to keep banging on about the problems, because it's only when you talk about them and make them, expose them, that you have a chance of solving them.
All right, should we now at 4 o'clock let Deborah get a final word in that somewhat optimistic and at least forward-looking note. And I ask you to join me in thanking all the panel members with a warm applause.